Hi everyone. This is one of my first videos for YouTube. This is Tony Guasco. Patty and I are missionaries to Portugal. We've been missionaries to Zimbabwe, Africa. Basically, we've been on the mission field for 16 years. I came across a great story that kind of summarizes the reason we do missions. You might be asking, why should I support a missionary? Why should I help anybody? There's enough need right here at home. Why should I give towards some people that I don't even know? Those are reasonable questions. But there is a very good spiritual answer as to why we do this. Well, first of all, the Bible clearly states that we are to go into all the world. But again, I ran across this great story. I think that you'll enjoy it if you just listen. Take the time to listen to this story. What an amazing story. In fact, it's called The Amazing Story of David and Svea Flood. It says, back in 1921, a missionary couple named David and Svea Flood went with their two children, 2-year-old son, that is, to a place that was called the Belgian Congo. They met up with another Scandinavian couple. In those days of much tenderness and devotion and sacrifice, they felt led of the Lord to set out from the main mission station and take the gospel to a remote area. This was a huge step of faith way back then. At the village of Nandolora, they were rebuffed by the chief, who would not let them enter his town for fear of alienating the local gods. The couple opted to go a half-mile up the slope and build their own mud hut. They prayed for a spiritual breakthrough, but there was none. The only contact with the villagers was with a young boy who was allowed to sell them chickens and eggs only twice a week. Svea Flood, a tiny woman, only 4 foot 8 inches tall, decided that if this was the only African she could talk to, she would try to lead the boy to the Lord. In fact, she succeeded, but there were no other encouragements, no other salvations. Meanwhile, malaria continued to strike one member of the little band after another. In time, the Ericksons decided they had had enough suffering, so they returned to the main mission station. But David and Svea remained near this little village to go on it alone. Then, of all things, Svea found herself pregnant in the middle of the primitive wilderness. When time came for her to give birth, the village chief softened enough to allow a midwife to come up and help her. A little girl was born, whom they named, it's a difficult name, but it's Ayan. The delivery, however, was exhausting, and Svea Flood was already weak from many bouts of malaria. The birth process was a heavy blow to her stamina. She only lasted another 17 days before she died. Inside David Flood, something snapped at that moment. He dug a grave, buried his 27-year-old little wife, then took his children back down the mountain to the mission station, giving his newborn daughter to the Ericksons. He snarled and said, "I'm going back to Sweden. I've lost my wife, and I obviously can't take care of this little baby. God has ruined my life." With that, he headed to the port, rejecting not only his calling, but God himself. Within 8 months, both the Ericksons were stricken with a mysterious malady and died within days of each other. The baby was then turned over to some American missionaries, who adjusted her Swedish name to Aggie, and eventually brought her back to the United States at the age of 3. This family loved the little girl and were afraid that if they had tried to return to Africa, some legal obstacle might separate them from her. So they decided to stay home in America and switch from missionary work to pastoral ministry. And that is how Aggie grew up in South Dakota. As a young woman, she attended North Central Bible College in Minneapolis. There she met and married a young man named Dewey Hurst. Years passed. The Hurst enjoyed a fruitful ministry. Aggie gave birth first to a daughter, then a son. In time, her husband became president of Christian College in the Seattle area, and Aggie was intrigued to find so much Scandinavian heritage there. One day, a Swedish religious magazine appeared in her mailbox. She had no idea who had sent it, and of course she could not read the words. But as she turned the pages, all of a sudden a photo stopped her cold. There, in a primitive setting, was a grave with a white cross, and on the cross were the words of Svea Flood. Aggie jumped in her car, went straight for the college faculty member who she knew could translate the article. "What does it say?" she demanded. The instructor summarized the story and said, it was about a missionary who had come to this little village long ago, the birth of a white baby, blah, 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 the death of a young mother, the little African boy who had been led to Christ, and how after the whites had all left, the boy had grown up and finally persuaded the chief to let him build a school in the village. The article said that gradually he won all of his students to Christ. Even the chief had become a Christian. Today, there were 600 Christian believers in that one village alone, all because of the sacrifice of David and Svea Flood. The Hurst 25th wedding anniversary, the college presented them a gift of a vacation to Sweden. There, Aggie sought to find her real father. The old man now, David Flood, had remarried, fathered 4 more children, and gradually dissipated his life with alcohol. He had recently suffered a stroke. Still bitter, he only had one rule in his house, and that was never mention the name of God, because God had taken everything away from him. After an emotional reunion with her half-brothers and half-sister, Aggie brought up the subject of seeing her father. The others hesitated. "You can't talk to him," they replied, "even though he's very ill now." But she persisted. "But you need to know one thing. Whenever he hears the name of God, he will fly into a rage." Aggie was not deterred. She walked into the dirty apartment with liquor bottles everywhere and approached the 77-year-old man lying on a rumpled bed and said, "Papa," she said tentatively. He turned and began to cry and pronounced her name. "Aina," he said. "I never meant to give you away." "It's all right, Papa," she replied, taking him gently in her arms. "God took care of me." The man instantly stiffened and tears stopped. "God forgot about all of us. Our lives have been like this because of him." He turned his face back to the wall. Aggie stroked his face and then continued, undaunted, "Papa, I've got a little story to tell you, and it's a true one. You did not go to Africa in vain. Mama did not die there in vain. The little boy you won to the Lord grew up to win that whole village to Jesus Christ. The one seed you planted just kept growing and growing. Today there are over 600 African people serving the Lord because you were faithful to the call of God in your life. Papa, Jesus loves you. He has never hated you." The old man turned back to look into his daughter's eyes. His body now relaxed. He began to talk. And by the end of the afternoon, he had returned to the Lord, and he had returned to the Lord he had resented for so many years, now decades. Over the next few days, father and daughter enjoyed warm moments together. Again, her father soon had, Aggie and her husband soon had to return to America, and within a few weeks, David Flood had gone on to eternity. He had died. A few years later, the Hurst were attending a high-level evangelism conference in London, England, when a report was given from the nation of Zaire, as it is now called. The superintendent of the national church, representing some 110,000 baptized believers, spoke eloquently on the gospel spread in his nation. Aggie could not help but to go and ask him afterwards if he had ever heard of David and Svea Flood. "Yes, madam," the man replied in French, his words being translated into English. "It was Svea Flood who led me to Jesus Christ. I was the boy who brought food to your parents before you were even born. In fact, to this day, your mother's grace and her memory are honored by all of us. He embraced her a long time, sobbing as he hugged her, and then continued, "You must come to Africa and see, because your mother is the most famous person in our history." In time, that is exactly what Aggie Hurst and her husband did. They were welcomed by cheering throngs of villagers. She even met the man who had been hired by her father many years ago to carry her back down the mountain in a little cradle. The most dramatic moment, of course, was when the pastor escorted Aggie to see her mother's white cross there. She knelt in the soil to pray and give thanks. Later that day, in a church, the pastor read from John 14:21. It says, "I tell you the truth, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it does die, it produces many seeds." He then followed by Psalm 126, verse 5. "Those who sow in tears will reap with joy," with songs of joy. 110,000 people came to Christ because one couple dared to go